Welcome to Mysteries, Histories and Now. So this is going to be a podcast that's going to air hopefully fairly frequently, and we're going to talk about pretty much anything that can be, mystery stuff, historical stuff, things that are going on right now. For now, it's just myself. I think I plan to have some guests on in the near future to talk about some quite unique topics that are probably going to be quite interesting. Also, we'd really like to encourage any feedback, so if you do like it, like the podcast, then by all means leave some comments, leave some other things maybe you want us to discuss in the future, and we can certainly look into those. As for this first episode, because this is going to be episode 1, we're really looking at the beginning, so Genesis, I guess, not in the biblical sense, but in the beginning of everything. And to touch on this subject, we're going to start with water. So you'll have to bear with me a minute, because that sounds a bit strange of a starting point, but I promise you I'll get round to making it all make sense. So what's quite interesting, it's pretty unusual in the fact that it's kind of a strange thing. So there's not many elements, for instance, that expand when they become a solid, and water does. So it's quite a reasonably unique property, not completely unique. I think there are other elements that do it. I think silicon might be one, but it is kind of strange. And the other thing that's kind of strange is we don't destroy or create water. I mean, pretty much everything else we have a dabble at, but water, it's not to say it can't be done. Water can be created, and actually requires a fair bit of energy, and it's quite volatile, and it's a pretty explosive thing. I mean, this has happened historically before in the past, but it's not something we do really. So typically water is neither created or destroyed, and it's quite constant in our lives. And if you think about water, so it has its three states. So it's either frozen, it's a liquid, or it's a solid, or it's a steam, sorry. And even when you think about organically in our bodies, so water is quite strange in the fact that we desperately need it. However, we get rid of so much of it. So much of it it's kind of used and almost like a lubricant, and then it's expressed either through sweat or breathing, or excreted through urine. So water kind of goes through a journey through ourselves. Now, what's kind of crazy about water is when you really think about it, is because of the fact that we don't destroy it, we don't create it, and it's kind of just about. So water really is everywhere. I mean, when you think about it, we're breathing it in, it's in most of our foods, we're drinking it, it's pretty unavoidable. I mean, atmospherically, it's pretty much everywhere. It's just something we need so badly, we take it for granted completely. And there's some really mind-blowing things to think about when it comes to water. So you can probably assume quite reasonably that the amount of water we have in total, if you've taken the whole of the earth, you probably could quite happily say that it's quite a finite thing. But it's finite in the sense that there's an amount of it, and because we're neither destroying nor creating it, essentially, it's not really going anywhere. It's being moved from place to place. Of course we have droughts and floods, but exactly that. So, where one place is having a drought, another place will have a flood. So it's moving around. It's almost, it's a fluid. It's almost sentient. It kind of does its own thing. And it's just so massively important. And here's the crazy mind-blowing part of that. So there's obviously an amount of water in your body at any given time, and that water, you have no idea where that's been. So the water in your body right now could have been in Cleopatra's body, or Napoleon's, or Julius Caesar, or any number of prominent historical figures, which is quite mind-blowing when you think about it. This is just passing through us all the time, and at any time we could be embodying the very water that's been through endless generations of people. So when you think about it like that, is there more to water? And this is where I get to the sort of Genesis part. So this is where it gets really kind of interesting. So I will actually read some excerpts from some really interesting passages from various creation stories and myths. But for now, I just want to talk about it in a much broader sense, just to kind of give you an idea of what I mean. So I went through a bit of a period when I was thinking of starting this podcast of just I had loads of various interesting things that I think should be talked about, and it's just interesting and fun to talk about certain things, and especially the certain people I know, and I know lots of people in different expertise and different networks, and I always have interesting conversations with these people because their outlooks are completely different to mine, and they always have interesting things to add. And that's when I got to thinking, do you know what, it'd be really cool to get some of these people in a room and we'll just have a chat about it and see what people think, and certainly get interaction and feedback from other people, like listeners. So that's kind of where the whole thing, the inception of this idea started. And then one of the things I'd been reading a lot about, I was really interested, I love mythology as a rule anyway. It kind of started with Greek mythology when I was a lot younger, and then I've kind of touched in loads and loads of different mythologies all over the world. And obviously with any mythology, what I always find really interesting about it is the creation myth. So how people believe the world started. And I think there's the similarities between most creation myths is a little bit frightening considering that you've got to kind of think about the idea that these people were probably reasonably isolated. They hadn't sort of got the big intercontinental travel we have today. I mean, of course, people traveling around in boats and things, and it depends on which different time period you're looking at. And I'm no historian. I have a massive love for it, but without certainly looking at what we know and what's been documented, off the top of my head, I couldn't relate to you properly, but it is super interesting, the similarities in these stories. And the thing that blew my mind most, I think, when I looked at all these, is there was one key thing that really stood out that just seems to be overlooked, because most creation myths have the idea of a god or deities, and that's either one or two or multiple or lots. And there's there's almost a hierarchy of the structure of gods and how it plays out, and the importance they had in the various development, if you like, of the earth and creation and space and time and all the other things that go with it. But there's one really weird standout feature that is really not discussed. I mean, I read many creation stories and many articles based on these creation stories, and the one thing that was discussed always was the gods, the kind of order of events and how things came about. And the one thing that was massively overlooked was water. And what's really odd about all these stories is they all start with water as the precursor to God. So in all these stories, I mean, Genesis is a great example. It always talks about water as if it was always there. It's like water was there first, and then the gods did something with water. And even in the stories where it talks about a void, it talks about water as the void. And this isn't just a handful of these stories. I mean, we're talking, I think I must have read, I think it was something like 120, 140 something creation myths. So yeah, I had a lot of time on my hands when I was looking at these things. But the fact that in nearly all of them, apart from some really weird obscure ones, which still really, might reference breath or something water related at least, pretty much all of them had water as the precursor to God. And I found that really interesting because of the sort of everlasting nature and what's the word for it? So the constant presence of water. I know there's a word for this, but what I'm getting at is it's just ever present. It's always here. It's existed throughout history. Everyone's been touched by it, and most importantly, it's absolutely essential for everything, like literally everything. And the fact that in all these stories, it's almost like if we hypothetically just said for a moment, okay, we believe in the stories, and we believe whichever story you read, and it kind of doesn't matter, and we believe in gods or gods. It's really interesting that the building block required by God, the precursor that came before God, was the very thing that we call, well, the water of life, the thing we need now. It just seems really strange that they would all have this one thing in common. I mean, like I said, all the stories, they're very different from the top down. They start with water or void, and it is all descriptions of water really. Then we go to God or gods, and it kind of steps down from there, and the stories obviously branch out and change, and there's different interpretations of what people thought happened. But the main unifying factor is actually not God or gods, because they're all described very differently across the different cultures and ideas. But the unifying thing in all of it is water. So what I'm going to do next is I just want to read a couple of these out so you can just kind of get an idea of what I mean. And I'm obviously not going to read 120, but a couple, 2 or 3, or maybe 4 or 5 might be a good idea, just to kind of see what your thoughts are. And then I'm going to go into some other odd and peculiar things about water. So just bear with me a second. Right, so I think first we'll start with Genesis, just because it's just so well known. And it's also super interesting. So Genesis goes as follows. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." So with all of these, I'm only going to read like literally the first tiny bit, because it's the first crucial bit that's the most important. So what we notice about that is it says that God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty. And then it says darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, implying that the Spirit of God and the darkness over the waters, implying that the waters were already there. At no point does Genesis explicitly say that God created the waters. There just was waters. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to pick some stories from kind of all over the world so we can really dig into this. So the next one I'm going to read is the beginning of the Babylonian creation myth. It says, "In the beginning, neither heaven nor earth had names. Apsu, the god of fresh waters, and Tiamat, the goddess of salt oceans, and Mummu, the god of the mist that rises from both of them, were still mingled as one." So even before we get the names of the gods, we're talking about water, salt oceans, and mist, which is obviously a byproduct of water. So that's Babylonian. Then let's look at the Cherokee creation story. "The earth began as nothing but water and darkness, and all the animals were in," I'm going to totally ruin this, but we'll try anyway, Galunlati. Apologies for anyone who can speak Cherokee. Above the stone vault that makes up the sky. So again, the earth begins as nothing but water and darkness. Okay, so the next one I've got is the Norse creation myth. It said, "In the beginning of time there was nothing, neither sand nor sea nor cool waves." So you go, wait, hold up a minute. That doesn't make sense for the whole water thing. But let me get to it. "Neither heaven nor earth existed. Instead, long before the earth was made, Niflheim was made, and it was in it a spring gave rise to 12 rivers." So before anything, whatever Niflheim was, there was a spring, which is obviously water, which gave rise to 12 rivers before anything else, before we talk about gods or anything. Okay, so let's look at the Hawaiian. So I've tried to keep these reasonably obscure as well, so that they're not things people would commonly know, so we can compare them to Genesis as well. So, when the earth first became hot, and the heavens churned, and the sun was dark, land emerged from the slime of the sea. So, again, the sea is entirely implied of being present before anything else. So that's, like I said, that's just 5 of these. I mean, I'd really encourage anyone. For starters, they're cool stories. They're worth having a look at anyway, and they're good fun to tell your kids. I mean, I tell my kids all kinds of creation myths, just because they're cool fun. You have to be careful with some of the Greek ones though, because they can be a bit adult, shall we say, for children. But otherwise, have a dig into these. Have a look. They're really, really interesting because nearly every single one starts with water. So that gets me on to my next point. So the other crazy thing, and this is, we're going into the world of speculation here, but you know, it's interesting nonetheless. So water has some really peculiar properties. So there was an interesting experiment. I can't for the life of me remember who did it. So I will try and find some links and pop them in a description for people to sort of verify what I'm saying. But there was an interesting experiment done where they were almost testing the memory of water and also testing emotions with water. So that sounds really odd, and it is. and how verifiable it is questionable, because I like to sort of know concrete on anything that I try and talk about. But this is just something a bit out there that I wanted to touch on. So what they tried to do is they tried to basically attempt to influence water with human emotions. So people would express, you know, very positive feelings or happy things, and you know, generally things that people would associate with feeling well and good. And then they also expressed emotions that were considered negative, like anger, jealousy, spitefulness, that kind of thing. And what they did is they froze the water, and what it appeared is, on a microscopic level, the crystallization of the water seemed incredibly different depending on what emotion it was subjected to. So I believe some of the waters were read things like the Lord's Prayer, or played, you know, classical operatic masterpieces and things like that. And the crystallization of the water was very symmetrical and beautiful, and the kind of thing you'd hope to see, really. And then the very negative things they did, so I think they did some kind of weird satanic things, and like I say, some angry things, and just general negative emotions they could portray at this water. And I think they tried to keep it reasonably genuine. I think the people who conducted it were in this sort of state when they did it. And again, on the microscopic level, when they looked at the crystallization of it being frozen, it was very chaotic and not particularly nice to look at. You know, you might say ugly. And that was kind of interesting, kind of weird. And the other thing that's been suggested quite recently is water may retain some form of memory. Now, this is something I think it's a very new idea, and I'd have to dig into it really properly and probably come back to you with something a bit more worthwhile, maybe in a later episode or something like that, if we go through this again. But what's kind of interesting to me about the idea is if you assume that water did have some form of memory, I mean, what's it remembering? So does it work like, I mean, we can obviously record data on a disc or magnetic tape. There's various ways in which we record data, and I'm a super techie geeky guy, so I'm quite, although I am recording this on my phone, which is really sad, but yeah, so it's quite interesting the ways in which we can record data. For instance, the rings of a tree, it will record, you know, if you look at the rings of the tree, you can find out, you know, years it might have had disease or struggled or been impoverished. Also, there's, if you and really off the topic, but an eel, for instance, so an eel has a bone in its head, sort of where the cheek would be, I guess, the gill, let's say. And not only does this bone record the years of the eel's life, you can also sort of measure how well it was doing at those stages. So again, there's sort of various pieces of memory dotted about in various forms, and humans have got particularly good at recording it down. So now what we're looking at in terms of sort of recording digital data, we're looking at holographic methods of storage, which is vastly superior to the sort of 2D storage, if you like, that we've got currently. So this would be a 3D level of storage, which, because we're working in three-dimensional space, gives us an opportunity to store vastly more information. Now, so like I say, because the nature of water, if we assume for a second, just as a bit of a thought experiment, that it did have some form of memory, well, there's a hell of a lot of it, and it's been around forever in everything from seals to elephants to people to insects to, water's about. So it's almost like if it had any form of memory, it'd be like the record keeper of the earth, which should be quite interesting. And it would also make quite a lot of sense as well. If you're going to have something there from the start and essentially to the end, then you'd probably want at least something integral, sort of intertwined, if you like, keeping track of things. So it's just something strange to bear in mind. So the next thing I really wanted to get back to is we go back to this creation myth thing. So I'd like to explore this a little bit deeper. And certainly, if anyone's got any thoughts on this, or they read something I haven't that's interesting, then by all means shout up again in the comments. But so if water was the precursor to God, and we kind of assume that was the case based on these stories, then there's other questions that arise from that. Some are going to be really complicated, like, well, where did the water come from? So if you're going to say, yeah, okay, God's created things, then who created the water? Was there a God created that? It's almost like the chicken and the egg thing. It's an endless thing. So perhaps that's too deep to try and fathom, based on the fact that these are just stories, essentially. But what we could do is you could say, well, okay, so if water was there, and we just look at the Earth as we know it right now. So when they do really, really deep dives into the Mariana Trench, which is one of the deepest places on Earth, what they found was they found another. It almost looks like a lake under the sea, and I think there's really high speculation as to what exactly that is, but I don't think they're 100% sure. So we'd have to check up on that. But basically, the lake exists, and when the submersible tries to penetrate it, it's so thick it just can't be penetrated, and it's essentially a lake of water under the water, and there is a discernible difference. So a good example would be if you ever see fresh water running into seawater at any point, you'll notice it's really strange. I've actually done it snorkeling once, where you can be under the water and the water's nice and clear from your vantage point, assuming you've got a sort of apparatus on your face so you can see better, like goggles or similar. But when you look into where the freshwater mixes, obviously it's really, really unclear. It's very blurry because it's completely different. And then when you enter the freshwater, similarly, when you look back at the saltwater, you see that effect again. So it kind of looks like that. So there's a clear separation. There's a clear lake at the deepest point of the ocean that we've yet to explore, that can't be penetrated. Now, I think one theory is that it's just very high salinity. So there's a huge amount of salt, and it's incredibly thick and almost soupy. And that means it's got an incredibly high surface tension, especially because it's under such pressure, being so deep, and therefore it can't be penetrated.
which is quite plausible. But the fact that it couldn't be penetrated, I would guess they took no samples of it whatsoever. So I think that's just pure speculation, on the sort of science part, which is, let's be fair, no one I know is diving to the bottom of the Mariana Trench with a submarine. So that's impressive as it is to even see that. So that's interesting. And then if we look at the inverse of that and look up and we look into space, I've always found space super fascinating, and there's something really another tangent I'm going to go on here, but there's something really interesting about water. So if you take water and have a little air bubble in the water, and you expose that to high frequency waves, high frequency sound, I believe, then you can actually make the air bubble shine incredibly bright, and it looks, there's no other way to describe it than it looks exactly like a star. And I'm not going to say I believe one way or the other, because I have no clue. But if you take the example of the Bible, so where it says that the water was separated, and to the waters above and the waters below, and you go, okay, well, we can kind of see some kind of weird, dense, certainly different materialization of water below us as far as we can see. Then above us, is it so much of a stretch to suggest space might be similar and the stars that we're seeing might be similar? Because you've got to think there's frequency everywhere, including space. So could that be making the stars shine? I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily buy the whole idea that, that there's these massive suns, millions and millions of miles. I mean, we have no clue. I mean, there's some nice hypothesis, but until I've, physically can sort of test or see things, I'm always skeptical. And, the fact that we can just make these insane distances of like billions of light years and go, yeah, it's definitely a big gas ball. We definitely know what it's made of. We've never been there. We've never been to our own sun. We haven't got a clue really, but this is what we think. It seems a little bit arrogant to me, but that's our kind of best guess at the moment, I suppose. But back on track. So the whole water situation is really strange. And does that mean that, so if let's again entertain the idea that we can't penetrate this water barrier below us, and let's entertain the idea that at a certain point we couldn't penetrate a water barrier above us, then it kind of begs the question, and this again is just jumping off into a totally weird realm here. So there's been loads and loads and loads of simulation theory ideas, and I've read quite a few of them, and they're again really interesting, and who the hell knows. But if you take any simulation, like a computer game or anything simulated in any form of sort of computer hardware or or software that we have today, then obviously the one thing that's always present is there's a limitation to the extent of where that goes. And some things can be super, super massive, but the end result is you get to a point where you hit a barrier, a finite barrier, where there's just simply nothing else to compute. It just stops. It's just we're at the limit of what can be computationally possible. And it's just, that's it. It's an invisible wall, essentially. You've hit it, and that's that. So if we thought of water as having some form of memory or some form of data storage, or maybe even some form of code itself, then is that the limitations of our simulation we're hitting? I don't know. And what makes me kind of think that is, so we take computer games as a really good example. So there's a game, I've never actually played it, but there's a game, it was released on PC many years ago, and I believe it's still going, and it's various iterations on consoles and things like that. I think it's super popular. It's The Sims. And the idea behind The Sims is you have these little avatar type people, and they can kind of live their lives, and there's a certain level of AI to them, so they get about with their business, and I'm assuming you can build and manipulate their world. And it's quite popular, and obviously that's really basic. But essentially what we've done there is we've made a really primitive simulation of something, of an environment, let's say. And the AI might be really, really strictly coded in the fact that it's not AI, so to speak. It's more a set of instructions that the little avatars are having to follow, their little sprites and things are having to do. Now, as AI certainly improves, there's going to be a point where we can make these simulations and we can give the AI a little bit of autonomy. So it can maybe make its own decisions, not strictly based on a set of rules that we program, but based on things it could potentially learn, and it could learn its own rules and its own ideas and kind of do its own thing. And there's going to be a point with the constant expansion of technology, there's going to be a point where we could simulate, and let's not say the Earth, because that's crazy, that's super massive, but let's say you simulated just a room, just like a bedroom or a living room or whatever, and you could simulate the physics correctly in there as it would be in the real world. You could simulate every object in there as it would be in the real world, and the manipulation thereof of it. So, example, let's say you had an avatar in there, they could pick up a lighter and actually set fire to something and the physics would be correct, or they could drop something or smash something or build something, and you just concentrate on something small, just as small as a room. There's going to be a point, I would say fairly soon, that we're going to be able to do that. And then you've got to question, well, if we get the AI good enough in that simulation, we'd just look at it as a simulation and that'd be that. But if you kind of get the AI thinking in there, then at what point will it go, okay, where am I, what am I in? So at that point, it's super similar to our situation where we're thinking, well, what am I and what am I in? And let's expand this idea even further. So let's say we go even further into the future, we can generate a whole entire Earth with all the physical properties, and let's say we can make AI as good as a human, and we can populate it with as many AI as we want, or as few as we want, or start it with just a couple that breed out, like a kind of Adam and Eve thing. Then what happens then? Do they know they're in a simulation? Would we even bother telling them? And then the other thing to this is like, okay, so let's think about, take another tangent here, and let's think about chimpanzees for a minute. So chimpanzees, how often in your day, apart from let's say you're something really niche like a zookeeper, or you're exploring, the Congo or something, but on a daily basis, how often do you really think about chimpanzees? It's like never. They don't even cross your mind. So if we take that as a kind of primitive life form to us, it never crosses our mind. So if we were to ever get to a point where we make a sort of general artificial intelligence that's vastly more intelligent than us, so we'll just step away from the simulation idea just for a little second. It will tie up, I promise. So we take this general AI that's vastly superior to us. It's pretty terrifying, because if this thing can run in a way that it doesn't necessarily need to procreate, or if it does, it will do it immensely more efficiently than we do for immensely less resources, and if it's more of let's say it was literally on a computer or something, and opposed to being a physical thing that has to walk around and eat and sleep and all that and take up more space, then it could potentially have all these advantages over us. And then without it having, I mean, you've got to hope that anything that can learn can also learn empathy. So that's at least one thing in our favour. But let's assume for a second that it thinks of us like the chimpanzees, or rather doesn't think of us. Then it might just go, well, yeah, I can just kind of carry on my existence without ever interacting with you guys whatsoever, because I don't need to anymore. You're so stupid compared to where I'm at that you're not even worth interacting with. There's nothing valuable to gain here. So that scenario, that's probably not a terrible scenario. So we just kind of have this very aloof, Mardu robot thing that kind of does its own stuff. But that's okay. It might decide that actually I need to move forward, and the way to do that is, let's bin these guys off because they're just eating resources and they're not all that important. And that's pretty terrible. Or we have the scenario where, by some fluke and chance, that we've managed to teach this thing as it's kind of matured that it should love and respect us, and we're kind of a creator, and it's really important regardless of how amazing it gets, almost like a prodigal child. And that's another possibility that could be useful. The other thing that could happen, or could have already happened as a hypothetical, is what if it decided that, okay, we can just simulate all this. We don't need it. We don't need the physical demands. We don't need any of it. We just need kind of me at the helm and simulate. And is this an everlasting cycle? Do we reach this point and then re-simulate, and then it just goes on? Because the thing is as well, and I think there's actually and I promise I'm not trying to plagiarise this, but I think this is like a Rick and Morty episode, so props to them, where there's like a simulation in a simulation in a simulation. And that sort of makes sense. I mean, it would, if we made a simulation so great and so amazing with all the AI and whatnot, and then they eventually get to the point where they're like, oh, we can create a simulation. And the other thing is, how many would you make? And you'd probably make lots to test it, and then how many of those would you bother looking at afterwards? Let's say you made 2,000, and then you go, well, this one's running quite well, we'll study this one for a bit, but the rest are kind of, they're all right, a little bit failure, not as important, this one's the most advanced, and they kind of just tick over, and we kind of forget about them. So and then that then expands out into, well, this whole sort of parallel universe. Like, is there multiple universes and multiple things going on? Well, if you took, let's say we made 10 simulations, and those simulations inside there made 10 more simulations each, so we're up to 100, and so on and so forth, and it just kept going, then eventually every possibility would be possible. It really would be infinite, because it would never have a reason to stop. So I feel like I've moved miles away from water now, but to try and desperately claw my way back and tie this back to water. So water just seems to have something. It just seems to be something, and the way it works is really interesting as well. So it's, if you think about our modern world, so Wi-Fi, for instance, so it's essentially, it's a frequency, it's a wave, it's in waves. And the unusual thing about water is, in the state that we all exist, that our environment exists, it's liquid, and ripples and waves, and very much has frequency all of its own. So even though we perceive it, like, we don't perceive, the sort of non-visible parts of the light spectrum, like radio waves. We know they're there, we can measure them, we know how they behave, but we don't perceive it with our limited senses. Whereas water we can. But does that make it any less special in terms of frequency and wave and how it works? Probably not. I think we probably view things in, humans are very cool at like breaking things down and getting down to the nitty gritty on everything. What we tend not to be so cool about, I think, is tying in the broader associations with those various things. We don't seem to be excellent at that. I just feel like everything to me feels way more interconnected than we kind of give it credit. And we like I say, we're really good at parsecting it down and going, yep, these are all the little components. And we know instinctively it makes up a whole, but we don't always know how those bigger wholes kind of fit together and influence each other. And I'm pretty sure that every tiny thing ever that's going on ever is influencing almost everything all of the time. You know, from you waving your hand and you move a little bit of air, well, it's moved a bit of air in your room, and I guess that dissipates slowly. But things have happened, energy has been dispersed, stuff's moving around. It's always happening. And water is the embodiment of that. I mean, it's a really weird, special thing. So maybe, just maybe, water is the beginning. And maybe there was never nothing. Because nothing kind of doesn't make any sense. And here's the other thing about water, is if you look at entropy, so everything else just breaks down and just eventually dissipate. I mean, you take a rock, you know, it weathers, picks crack off it, eventually becomes, you know, gravel or fragments, and then it becomes finer still, it becomes sand, until eventually, you know, it's nearly nothing. It can become, you know, dust and then washed away and particulate. Water isn't that. It doesn't do that. It just changes state and moves somewhere else. And at any given time, water's constantly being invaded by, you know, different elements and, you know, biological materials. But eventually, you know, it frees itself of that as well. You know, let's take a pond that's, you know, got loads of weed on, and it's getting all messed up over time, and eventually it becomes so saturated with gloop that there's just not enough water for. So a few things happen. The plants die, become mulchy, and the water starts to evaporate off, and the water evaporates off, and it kind of relocates itself, and then you end up with a little dried pond, and it's gone. So water's really good at moving around. And the other strange thing, the other thing that does that in a different way, is gold. So gold doesn't seem to want to react with anything. It's like it doesn't want to play anyone's games, just like water. Except the oceans and water as a whole, and we're not just talking chunks here, we're talking at, you know, a tiny level, a molecule level. Water is filled with gold. So I dread to estimate how much gold's in the oceans, but it's a bloody lot. So that's odd as well. And we value, well, gold's interesting because we value that so highly. And there is cool uses for gold, you know. I mean, it's really good for, you know, like making hard drives, for instance, and, you know, for reducing interference and things on like your headphones, which is why you have a little gold plug on it. And, you know, gold's quite useful for lots of different things. But we do value it in a really strange way. I mean, it's a metal that we can't typically, unless you're manufacturing something that requires it, we don't need gold. It looks kind of pretty, and I guess it takes its value from the fact that you could have, let's say, a gold ring, and it's not going to, you know, fall apart or look terrible in a few years. You know, it's going to maintain itself. Gold's gold. It's non-reactive. So I guess that's a reason to value it. If we went really back and went, oh yeah, we like shiny things, so that's cool, that's shiny, and it stays shiny, so we like that the most. Out of all the shiny things, that's the shiniest cool thing. But it is strange that the value we put on a metal that we pretty much use for nothing. And then water's almost the flip side of that. It almost has no value, but it has the ultimate value. Like, we barely think about it, and I know that's, you know, me coming from England. It's, you know, water. We live on a tiny bloody island. It's, you know, water's not going to be an issue. It's small and rainy and miserable and wet, so we've got water. And I can imagine, you know, people who have experienced real drought and things would certainly argue with me, and quite rightly so, that, you know, that's no joke. Having no water is not any fun. But again, it's a relocation of water. So, you know, if you were in a drought area, then what you do is you go to an area that doesn't have drought. You know, you move around a bit, and sure enough, you'll get to water. So anyway, some food for thought. Like I say, the next episode I'm planning, I'm hopefully going to have a guest with me, and we're going to discuss some things, and you know, not just my boring ideas, but we'll get some ideas from. First of all, interesting different ideas will be nice, and hopefully, if I can get some experts on certain subjects, we'll touch on some other things that that might be worth delving into. I think the general premise is I don't really know what I'm going to be doing. I'm quite happy to talk about anything really, and just see what the thoughts and views of other people are, and especially the listeners. So if you've got any ideas or anything you want to add, and what I might do, because of the nature of some of these topics, I mean, some are going to be really grounded, some are going to be really out there, some are going to be historical, some are going to be, you know, weird and wonderful. They might well warrant further investigation and discussion down the line. So I won't sort of close anything off and say that's the end. You know, we might well come back to this water thing. I know certainly I'd like to look into some certain things with it, and then maybe revisit it later down the line, but certainly not too soon, so we don't just get bored of talking about the same things. But anyway, thank you very much for your time. It's been super interesting. I am doing this in the most basic function at the moment. My laptop's currently out of commission. I was super eager to get this started, so I'm working on a phone, so I promise to improve the quality and equipment as we go, hopefully. And any comments, support or anything like that, feedback would be really welcome. And yeah, let's just keep thinking. It's the playground of ideas. And good evening.